Guys, I see a lot of you watching without subscribing. If you enjoy my stories, just hit that subscribe button and leave a few words in the comments. It helps a ton.
The air pressing against the windshield of the rented sedan carried the density of wet concrete, a flavorless, pervasive chill. It was late September in coastal Maine, and the cold, clammy mist rolling in from the dark, oil-slicked ocean clung to everything. The peeling paint of the clapboard houses, the chrome of the few parked vehicles, and especially the old wooden pilings of the pier. These pilings, barnacle-encrusted and warped by decades of tides, presented themselves to Andrew Price as the exposed, fractured vertebrae of some gigantic thing buried beneath the bay. Andrew, a freelance reporter of 42, carried the specific professional exhaustion that comes from covering too many stories that prove to be thin and unsubstantial. He drove slowly through the nameless town, the sedan's chassis rattling over potholes that had seen no repair since the previous decade. He had not been drawn here by a press release or a leaked memo, but by a stubborn metallic taste of truth he recognized in the sparse police blotters and local whispers intercepted online. The official narrative, accidental deaths, wildlife attacks, was tired, thin, and brittle. The reality, Andrew knew, was something far heavier. He rented the car, a cheap, smoke-saturated sedan smelling faintly of stale tobacco and pine sol, at the regional airport 50 miles inland. His first observation, recorded mentally and then quickly typed into his small, worn notebook, concerned the town's silence. It was not the comforting quiet of rural isolation, but something unnatural, stretched taut and wary. This silence did not stem from an absence of people. The town held a pulse, visible in the few tired faces staring out of storefront windows. It came from an extreme caution, a deliberate lowering of volume, a collective agreement not to see or discuss anything outside the acceptable, mundane routine. The inhabitants were waiting, holding their breath for something only they could anticipate. Andrew stopped at Gray's Diner, a low, squat building smelling overwhelmingly of old fryer oil, burnt coffee, and chlorine bleach. A specific aroma that became instantly nostalgic and vaguely depressing. He took a booth by the foggy window, ordering black coffee and a plate of scrambled eggs that tasted primarily of steam. This was where he met Henry Portman, the local forest ranger. Portman wore no crisply ironed uniform. He was clad in worn denim, a heavy plaid shirt, and boots caked with deep, reddish-brown forest mud. He looked as if the woods had grown out of him. Portman did not speak of mysticism or local legends. He spoke with a bleak, cold pragmatism about territory. "People disappear," Portman stated, stirring his coffee with the focused intensity of a surgeon. "They disappear when they breach certain unspoken laws. It is not about property lines, Mr. Price. It is about knowing where you are not meant to go." He leaned in, his voice dropping to a gravelly whisper that cut through the hiss of the fry grill. "The animals here are not the kind you read about in textbooks. They are the kind that know who hunts and who is hunted. And they know those boundaries better than any survey marker." It was not a spooky campfire story. It was a professional warning, stark and factual, about a domain marked by an intelligence beyond human understanding, an external will. Andrew had acquired a few redacted police reports and crime scene photographs through an old contact in the state capitol. The reports were aggressively brief, wild animal attack. But the evidence, specifically a blurred photograph taken near the last site, a disused sawmill a few miles outside town, told a different story. It showed an impression in the damp, sandy soil, a print left near where the remains had been discovered. It was not a bear or a coyote. Andrew stared at the printout for a long time in the weak diner light, feeling his professional skepticism crack like brittle ice. The heel shape was unmistakably human, but the phalanges, the toes, were elongated, disproportionately massive, ending in heavy, blunt talons. The print suggested immense power channeled through a familiar form. A cold, nervous hunger for the truth overrode his innate journalistic distance. When dusk bled the color from the already gray sky, Andrew drove back toward the bay to find lodging. The Sea Haven Motel was an establishment where time had stopped in the mid-1970s. The neon sign was missing the H and the N, flashing EAVEOEL in sickly pink. The owner, Nora Whitman, was a dry, tightly wound woman whose eyes, though tired, held a disconcerting, practiced vigilance. She smelled of starch and cheap hand lotion. She handed him the key to room 104, which smelled strongly of mothballs and the clean but fragile scent of old whitewash. She did not ask his purpose in town, a telling omission. As she gave him the heavy brass key, her fingers lingered momentarily on the back of his hand, a touch light as ash, but chillingly deliberate. "Do not go looking for what is already looking for you, Mr. Price," she rasped, her voice low and dry. She neither smiled nor offered sympathy. This town, bless its heart, is a self-sustaining grave. Andrew closed the door to 104, the cheap lock rattling ominously. The single window offered a view of the adjacent parking lot and the thick, low-hanging clouds that smothered the first appearance of the night sky, blocking any moonlight. He was unpacking his outdated recording equipment, a relic in a digital world, when the cheap motel phone buzzed once, indicating a voicemail. He played the message back. The voice was low, absolutely level, without any discernible regional accent, but possessed an articulation that sounded heavy and old, like worn leather. It spoke with chilling brevity. "If you want the truth, come tomorrow, midnight, Old Point Pier, recorder, alone." The line clicked dead. The message was cut short, immediate, brutal. It was not framed as a threat, but as an absolute certainty, a command issued by someone whose authority was unquestioned. Andrew felt a cold surge of adrenaline constrict his throat, banishing the exhaustion. This was it. This was his chance to break the silence. Midnight descended upon Old Point Pier not merely as darkness, but as a physical transformation of the environment. The air, already moist from the relentless ocean fog, absorbed all warmth and sound, making the cold a sharp, penetrating reality. Andrew Price parked the sedan a quarter-mile away, the engine cooling with a series of metallic ticks that sounded incredibly loud in the suffocating quiet. He walked the final stretch, the harsh scent of rust and sea salt assaulting his nostrils, mixed unsettlingly with a faint, damp smell, vaguely musky, like wet, coarse animal hair. He held the digital recorder in his coat pocket, its familiar plastic weight the only anchor he had against the deep, irrational dread building in his chest. The pier was a brutal landscape of concrete pilings and splintered wood, an industrial scar fighting a losing battle against the Atlantic. Andrew felt utterly exposed, utterly human, an irrelevant piece of soft machinery waiting in a place meant for hard endurance. He waited near the shadowy bulk of the derelict warehouse buildings that lined the back of the pier. The silence was absolute, save for the rhythmic, sluggish sloshing of the water beneath the deck. The man who eventually materialized was simply there. He did not emerge from the shadows so much as the shadows coalesced around him, granting him form. He introduced himself simply as Whitlock. He was tall, slightly stooped, dressed in a severely faded, heavy wool overcoat and old, cracked leather boots that still showed traces of dried road grime. His face was a road map of deep, intricate wrinkles, far too numerous for his apparent age, and his eyes held the same calm, crushing certainty that Andrew had heard in the recorded voice. Whitlock did not wait for questions. He began to speak the instant he was within conversational distance, his voice low and carrying clearly in the dense air. "We cut the mythology first," Whitlock stated, his hands resting on the rail, knuckles thick and unnaturally large. "I am 3 centuries old. This is not a miracle. It is a biological error, an exhaustion of the mechanism." His language was clinical, devoid of emotion. "I became what you call a werewolf, not by choice. It was an infection, a bite. My body simply refuses to accept your rules for dying." He described the recurring transformation not as a magical event, but as an exhausting, brutally mechanical process. Bone tissue becomes pliable, like cheap plastic. Joints stretch. Muscles reweave themselves. The pain threshold drops to withstand the structural rebuild, he explained, tapping his heavy boot on the wooden decking. The moon merely acts as an amplifier, a clock. It does not cause the shift. It just ensures the schedule. He spoke of it with the dispassionate tone of a mechanic describing a faulty transmission. The shift, the change, was trauma, every time. Whitlock offered no request for sympathy, no plea for justification. He laid out his code of existence with the detached precision of a seasoned predator defining its hunting range. The rules are simple. I do not destroy for food. I do not approach places where the vulnerable congregate, hospitals, schools, those sorts of places. He paused, his gaze fixed on the turbulent water 50 feet below. I eliminate those who come here specifically to prey upon the weak, those who bring unnecessary malice and disruption. I operate outside of society, but I police those who think they operate outside of morality. It was the cynical, yet frighteningly consistent logic of a solitary apex predator carving out an ecological niche in the fringes of civilization. "You want a monster for your story?" Whitlock asked, tilting his head slightly. "I will give you a man who learned how to be a monster correctly." Andrew, forcing his mind back to his journalistic training, finally managed to ask about the inherent risk of granting an interview that could result in his own exposure and subsequent hunt. Whitlock's response was immediate and unnerving. "The recording is my insurance. I have zero faith in your ability to be impartial, Mr. Price, but I have absolute faith in your instinct as a reporter who will not compromise a perfect, pristine piece of material." He drew closer, the faint, musky smell stronger now, though still subtle. "You are not documenting me. You are documenting what I say. This is not my apology. It is the logistics of survival. If you distort the truth, the value of the recording diminishes, and my protection vanishes." Andrew felt an intense realization settle over him. He was being guided, yes, but the hand guiding him was steel, heavy, and brutally honest. This creature or man or mechanism, whatever he was, needed the truth printed, not to save his soul, but to sustain his harsh, functional existence. Whitlock suggested they move, not for comfort, but for better acoustics and separation from the chilling wind. They settled on a pair of mossy granite blocks near the pier supports, sheltered somewhat from the persistent ocean spray. The conversation deepened, shifting from the pragmatics of the present to a lengthy, sprawling monologue that plunged deep into the forgotten strata of American history. Andrew kept the recorder close. The small red light, a fragile indicator of the immense, unwritten history being poured into the machine. Whitlock's voice was a low, steady current, describing the colonial frontier of New England. The pungent smells of damp, newly cut wood, pitch, gunpowder, and the ever-present, cloying fear of the unknown wilderness. The origin of his affliction, he explained, was starkly unromantic. It was not a grand mystical beast, but a starving, diseased albino wolf, driven mad by hydrophobia and desperation, cornered during a bitter winter storm. The bite was traumatic, clumsy, and agonizing. The first transformation, he recalled, was not a moment of ecstatic, mythic power. It was pure, consciousness-breaking agony in the deep woods, surrounded by the smell of decaying leaf litter and wet moss. It was like being remade by a clumsy, indifferent god, he narrated, his gaze drifting toward the faint gray horizon. Every joint was liquid fire. The sound of my own bones bending and fusing was the worst. It did not feel like power. It felt like a catastrophic medical event. He learned quickly that to survive, he had to embrace the pain, endure the breaking, and learn the rules of his new, unwanted reality. He moved into the 19th century, focusing on the rough-and-tumble roads and burgeoning industries. He worked the railroads, then as a stevedore in river ports. His existence became a masterclass in invisibility. He changed names, appearance, and geography with the regularity of the seasons, never permitting himself the dangerous luxury of attachment. Attachment is a flaw. It leaves a scent for the others to follow, and it makes the breaking harder, he said. He recounted his first intentional elimination, not out of hunger or bloodlust, but necessity. It happened in a filthy, reeking port town where a particularly vicious gang was exploiting people, trafficking them inland. I found them in a storage barn, about 200 yards from the docks, Whitlock recalled, his tone flat. It was not a rage. It was surgical. I went in fast, removed the threat, and was gone before the local watch knew what happened. He felt the surge of primal satisfaction, followed by an immediate, profound sense of self-disgust. The guilt never vanished, he admitted, but it was gradually replaced by a cold sense of duty to himself. If he could not be truly human, he would serve as a grim, unforgiving filter against those who celebrated inhumanity. The Great Depression formed another harsh chapter. Wandering through Wyoming, across Ohio, hitching rides on freight cars. The air then, he described, was thick with the smells of cheap gasoline, sweat, and despair. He lived on the fringes, surviving on odd jobs, seeing the worst of human desperation and cruelty. Andrew recognized, listening to the decades of accounting, that this was not the confession of a sinner seeking absolution, but the grim bookkeeping of extreme survival. Whitlock spoke of knives, of bullets, of wounds that tore through his temporary forms. The pain was always greater than any human injury, he said, but the healing was exponentially faster. He never used his unique condition for profit or comfort. He lived in the dirt and the shadows precisely to avoid drawing attention with luxury or stability. The post-war decades brought new challenges. the increasing density of population, and the scrutiny of modern bureaucracy. Whitlock adapted, mastering the art of urban camouflage, living in abandoned industrial shells, using the cacophony of highway noise to mask the sounds of his movements, blending into the anonymity of the forgotten places. It was then that he first observed the strange, beneficial side effect of his existence. The persistent, terrifying rumors about something in the woods worked as a profound disciplinary force. The fear of the unknown beast was more effective than any police patrol. "Were there any you regretted eliminating?" Andrew asked, the question breaking the long silence between Whitlock's historical accounts. "Every single one," Whitlock responded instantly, without inflection. "But the distinction between me and the filth I hunt is control. I deny them the chance to hurt others because they have already shown they will not deny themselves. This is not about righteousness, Mr. Price. It is about a necessary, brutal mechanism." He provided a logical framework, not an excuse, and Andrew, the lifelong rationalist, stared into the void of this framework, recognizing a cold, terrifying consistency. Whitlock abruptly yanked the narrative back into the immediate present, the chilling, tangible reality of the current coastal town. The historical weight lifted, replaced by the acute, sharp awareness of immediate danger. "In the last 3 years, things changed," Whitlock said, his eyes now focusing intensely on the darkness beyond the pier lights. "The city, despite its best efforts to appear dead, has begun attracting a new breed of scavenger. Not the old desperate kind, but a wealthy, entitled type. They come for what they call extreme tourism. Illegal hunting, under-the-table dog-fighting rings, adrenaline-fueled quests into the fringes of the law." He spat the word adrenaline out like something rotten. These people, he argued, were bringing a focused, deliberate violence into the woods, a threat he viewed as intolerable to his carefully negotiated, quiet existence. He detailed specific, recent incidents. 2 so-called trophy hunters who had ventured too deep, too well armed, too confidently. Whitlock had not eliminated them, he had merely terrified them. Their bodies were found lacerated but survivable, a warning. They told the wildest stories, which served my purpose better than silence. But then there was the man involved in the systematic abuse and abandonment of dogs. That one he had stopped permanently. He spoke of the sensory experience of the action. The sharp, coppery, metallic smell of fresh blood. That is the part that fights the control hardest, Whitlock admitted, his voice barely audible. It is not the sight, it is the smell. That scent, combined with the chemical spike of fear in the air, forces the last bits of the man to retreat, leaving only the operational necessity. This sensory detail, the metallic tang of blood, pierced the conversational flow, making the terror immediate and sickeningly real. Andrew gripped his recorder, feeling the nausea rise, recognizing the difference between hearing a description of violence and smelling it in the mind's eye. Andrew had already encountered Sheriff Hudson, the town's chief law enforcement officer, a stocky, taciturn man whose face looked molded from granite. Hudson maintained the official line, the accidental death and unidentified wild animal narrative, not because he was complicit in Whitlock's actions, but out of grim pragmatism. Hudson knew that hysteria was far worse, far more destructive than a silent, unseen guardian. He viewed Andrew as a direct threat to the fragile order. "You are going to turn this into a story, Mr. Price," Hudson had stated bluntly during their brief, tense exchange outside the diner. and a story will make us vulnerable. It will draw the wrong kind of attention, the kind that will not go home just because the lights are out. Andrew understood then that the sheriff was not denying the existence of the filter. He simply needed the filter to remain silent, unseen, and effective. As the days blended into nights, Andrew spent hours in the car, watching the edge of the dense forest surrounding the town's perimeter. He began to notice a change in the acoustic landscape. The forest was not just quiet. The silence was different. It actively swallowed sound. In this unnatural stillness, he registered the rustle of leaves at distances he previously thought impossible. Whitlock's hyper-acute sensory perception was beginning to transfer to the journalist, sharpening his awareness, turning a simple summer breeze into a whisper of doom. Whitlock confirmed Andrew's growing sense of unease. He mentioned that his 3 centuries of existence were taking a physical toll. Even such a robust, self-regenerating mechanism was subject to wear and tear. The transformations are becoming harder, more taxing, he confessed, touching the coat over the rib cage that had recently reassembled itself. The rebuilding phase takes longer now. The risk of losing control, of the animal overriding the calculation, increases every lunar cycle. He was not seeking longevity. He sought a definitive end, a logical cessation to his harsh duty. He needed one precise, disciplined publication to ensure his final departure was meaningful, a legacy of control rather than chaos. The second formal meeting was less about exposition and more about leverage. Whitlock initiated the conversation by proving his intimate knowledge of Andrew's past. Specifically, a major professional misstep several years prior concerning a rushed story that had wrongly accused a person, leading to a public frenzy and near catastrophe for the innocent subject. "You look for accuracy now," Whitlock stated, his eyes boring into Andrew under the pale, low morning light. "Because you were once careless. You seek redemption through precision of fact. That makes you suitable." He understood that Andrew was not chasing sensation for glory. He was chasing certainty to repair his own fractured sense of professional integrity. Whitlock then outlined a chilling proposition, one that utterly demolished the thin wall separating the journalist from the participant. It was a deal, harsh and non-negotiable. "I will explain the mechanism of the shift, how I manage the trauma, how I cover my tracks, how I calculate the flare-ups," Whitlock proposed. "But only if you spend one night in the deep woods with me. You will become a witness to the rule in action. Your role is only to observe. You will not intervene." The specifics he offered about the transformation process were gruesome and clinical. Forget the Hollywood effects. It is not misty smoke. It starts with sweat, a rank odor of ammonia and metallic discharge. Then the sound. A tearing, grinding noise like the cracking of old, heavy ice comes from the sternum. My vision shifts from color to almost monochrome, but the depth of field and sensitivity become absolute. "It is an illness, Mr. Price, a traumatic, self-inflicted surgery, not magic." He detailed the body's forced compliance, the sheer physical logistics of changing form. Andrew felt a profound internal revulsion. This was an absolute violation of every tenet of professional ethics. To witness a confrontation, especially one resulting in the elimination of criminals, was to become, by silence, an accessory. Yet to refuse was to walk away with only half the truth, a truth easily dismissed as the ramblings of a troubled recluse. The cold, unyielding hunger for the whole, unvarnished truth, the very thing Whitlock had diagnosed in him, won out over his fear and his ethics. He recognized that this coming night would be the crucible, either the genesis of his most significant work or his violent, unseen end. Whitlock accepted Andrew's silent nod as agreement. His final instructions were delivered without preamble or drama, the words falling heavily into the damp air. No lights. Wear dark clothing. Nothing reflective. The recorder must run continuously, no matter what happens. He paused, looking Andrew directly in the eyes. If you sense danger, or if I lose control, which is a persistent possibility now, you drop. Fall and play dead. Do not move until the smell, the metallic feral smell, has completely dissipated. He spoke of it with the quiet authority of an experienced guide detailing a route through an active minefield. The exchange was not sensational. It was a morbid, terrifying training session in survival. The deep woods behind the old rock quarry were suffocating. They were 3 miles beyond the limits of the town's last power lines, in a place where the air felt thick and damp, saturated with the overwhelming scent of decaying pine needles and saturated earth. The transition from town to wild was immediate. The moment they stepped off the faint logging track, the world changed from human geometry to wild, chaotic shadow. Andrew registered every one of Whitlock's movements. They were silent, efficient, utterly calculated. Whitlock moved with the economical gait of a man who had trained for centuries in avoidance. He selected a position that maximized the view and minimized the necessary exit velocity. The creeping certainty that Whitlock was not a wild beast but a soldier, refined by 300 years of perpetual, agonizing deployment, was far more paralyzing than the fear of a simple monster. Andrew flipped the small switch on the recorder, the tiny red indicator barely visible. He spoke nothing into it. The machine was merely documenting the silence and the atmosphere. He cataloged his own state, a tight, cold knot in his stomach, shallow breathing, and the surprising warmth of his layered clothes doing battle with the forest chill. The waiting was protracted, a period of agonizing, drawn-out quiet, broken only by the sporadic, high-pitched hum of insects. His senses, already heightened by Whitlock's proximity, continued to sharpen. He detected the specific odor of wet moss and the distant, subtle scent of wood smoke. It was well past 2 in the morning when the first sounds of intrusion broke the deep quiet. 2 heavy-duty pickup trucks, their engines muffled but audible, pulled down a previously unseen access road leading into a clearing 50 yards away. The men who emerged were masked, dressed in practical, tactical gear. They moved with professional focus, unloading large, sturdy wooden cages from the truck beds. The air instantly filled with the whimpering and desperate whines of caged animals. These were not drunken adrenaline junkies. They were seasoned operators, organizers of an illicit, sophisticated dogfighting ring, arriving to dispose of non-performers and test the mettle of new ones. A floodlight, harsh and unforgiving, snapped on, illuminating the brutal tableau. The metallic tang of fear and the unmistakable, acrid smell of powder residue, from sedatives or earlier conflicts, slammed into the night air. The breaking point for Andrew came when one of the masked figures dragged a small, exhausted puppy, thin as a rail, from a burlap sack and began to roughly pull it toward a pre-dug pit. It was not the vague threat of violence that had been discussed. It was absolute, senseless cruelty being performed just feet away. Andrew felt his careful, calculated professional distance shatter. He could not watch. He instinctively lowered the recorder, tucking it under his arm, a silent internal admission. He was no longer a witness prepared to absorb all facts. He was now a human being rejecting the horror. In the span of a single heartbeat, Whitlock was gone. Andrew did not see the agonizing transformation, only the immediate terrifying result. The floodlight instantly extinguished, plunging the clearing into chaos. The structured silence of the forest was violently shredded by guttural cries, short, panicked, and utterly desperate. The air immediately thickened with the overwhelming sickly odor of hot animal fat and fresh, aerosolized blood. Closer now, violently immediate. Then, a fast, heavy, calculated padding sound. Silence returned, heavy and immediate, like a wet shroud dropped over the clearing. Whitlock reappeared, moving with the same efficiency as before, though his breathing was heavy, ragged. Deep, ragged lacerations marred his forearms, weeping blood onto the wool coat. He was holding something. He placed the shivering, traumatized puppy gently at Andrew's feet. "Go," Whitlock rasped, his voice sounding scraped raw. "Drive out and find Portman, the ranger. He knows. He will take the dog. Go. Now." The command was absolute. Andrew did not hesitate. He scooped up the small dog, wrapping it tightly in the protective layers of his own coat, and plunged into the shadows, leaving behind the clearing and the man who had become the silent arbiter of the night. Clutching the trembling, silent puppy beneath his coat, Andrew navigated the dark, rough track back toward the main road. The metallic smell of the air, the coldness of the dread, had become a physical presence, not just a psychological one. He did not run, but walked with a rapid, deliberate stride, focused on the small weight in his arms. He was less than half a mile from the sedan when the beams of a patrol car cut through the dense fog. Sheriff Hudson. Hudson pulled up slowly, his window rolling down with a mechanical whine that seemed to mock the recent silence. The sheriff looked tired, his eyes shadowed, reflecting the grim work that defined his town. He looked at Andrew, at the bundled coat, at the direction Andrew had just emerged from, and he understood everything without a single question being asked. He knew what Andrew had witnessed, and he knew what Andrew was carrying. "Are you going to write all that down, Price?" Hudson asked, his voice low and heavy, utterly devoid of threat, only resignation. Andrew, his voice strained, simply nodded. "Yes, every detail." Hudson took a long, slow breath, letting the information settle between them like heavy silt. "Then write about the filth that comes here too. Write about why we let the wild stay wild." He paused, reaching a decision that cost him dearly. Maybe that is the only thing that will actually stop them. Controlled fear is better than unchecked sickness. The sheriff, in that moment, became a silent accomplice, prioritizing the stability of his town over the rigid, broken requirements of the law. Andrew realized the full extent of the town's calculated, desperate truce. Back in the dim light of room 104, after successfully delivering the puppy to a wary but efficient Henry Portman, Andrew felt a physiological exhaustion that went deeper than simple lack of sleep. His rationalist facade was gone. He was no longer a skeptical outsider. He was a living witness to nature, or something far older than nature, responding to human depravity with an equal and opposite force. The boundary between justified horror and necessary justice dissolved within him. He dropped his coat on the worn armchair. The small digital recorder, which he had left running when he tucked it under his arm, sat on the nightstand. When he played it back, expecting only silence or his own panicked breathing, he heard something else. The conversation had continued after he left. Not Whitlock's breathing, but the quiet, low voices of two people. Nora Whitman, the motel owner, and Whitlock. They were not discussing the night's events directly, but they were discussing Andrew. "He needs the truth more than he needs the headline," Nora's dry voice said, sounding far less fragile than she appeared. "He will not sell the town for clicks. He will stay just long enough to see the shape of the thing." Then Whitlock's heavy, rasping voice. "I need a publication of accuracy. Let me become a local legend, but strip away the mythology. They need to fear coming here not because of a fairy tale beast, but because they face a variable that moves faster, calculates better, and operates without constraints." Andrew's heart pounded against his ribs. He understood the profound, uncomfortable truth. He had been selected. Not as a victim, and certainly not as a friend, but as an indispensable tool for maintaining public order through targeted dread. His professional morality screamed betrayal, but he was already inextricably immersed in the harsh, mechanical logic of Whitlock's system. He realized that Nora Whitman, Sheriff Hudson, Ranger Portman, they were all aware, or at least tacitly accepting of the situation. Not because they believed in ancient curses, but because they understood the brutal efficacy of the results. The low-level predators vanished. The locals enjoyed a grim, relative safety. The story was not about a single monster. It was about the fragile, brutal contract forged between a struggling coastal town and the profound, merciless entity dwelling in its bordering woods. Andrew drove back to the pier just as the first cold, bruised light of dawn attempted to break through the persistent ocean clouds. The heavy metallic smell of the previous night had been washed away by the tide and the pervasive salt air. Whitlock was sitting on the same weathered bench, but the posture of calculation was gone, replaced by profound depletion. He was hunched over, looking gaunt, his movements slow. A makeshift bandage, wrapped crudely but tightly, covered his upper left arm and shoulder. The rebuilding, Andrew recognized, had been excruciating. Whitlock smelled strongly of wet earth, ammonia-tinged sweat, and the sharp old odor of damp wool. There was no sense of triumph, only the deep, painful exhaustion of extreme exertion. "You saw enough," Whitlock stated, not looking at Andrew, but tracing the pattern of decay on the wood with a heavy finger. "Write it. But no myths. Do not turn me into a mask, and do not offer absolution. I am not in need of a defense attorney." He spoke softly, his voice dry and strained. "If the publication leads to a hunt, if it draws attention that becomes uncontrollable, I will depart. Not out of fear, because a true hunt turns everyone involved into animals, those who pursue and those who are pursued." Andrew waited until Whitlock gathered some inner strength, the silence between them long and heavy. Then he asked the one question that had gnawed at him since he had sheltered the puppy with his coat. "How many lives did it cost you to remain human?" He was not asking for a body count, but for the moral currency of 3 centuries. Whitlock did not answer with a number. He answered with a quiet, detailed anecdote. "About 70 years ago, I was moving through Ohio," he began, looking past Andrew, the memory vivid. "It was the height of summer. I was operating outside of my usual territory, the shift was due, and the hunger was severe. The control was thin. He recounted seeing a mechanic, a man whose hands were perpetually stained with grease and oil, running a small, beaten-up roadside garage. This man, the embodiment of unremarkable, exhausted Americana, kept a small cooler with a spigot, and always left a clean plastic jug of fresh water on a stool near the highway curb for the long-haul truckers passing through the heat. A simple, thoughtless act of generosity. I was close enough to strike. My senses were focused only on the fastest way to subdue and control the situation, Whitlock narrated, his voice hardening slightly at the memory of his own near loss of control. But I stopped. I saw the water. I saw that small, utterly senseless, pure act of kindness. The mechanic, the grimy, tired man from Ohio, survived the night. Not because he was strong or moral or lucky, but because Whitlock, in the full throes of the beast, was able to perceive a fragile, unearned moment of humanity. That was sufficient, Whitlock concluded, the sentence short and chillingly final. It was enough of a reason to maintain the mechanism. Andrew understood. Whitlock was not simply adhering to a rigid set of rules. He was constantly searching for empirical evidence that the rules were worth the excruciating effort of adherence. The boundary between the man and the creature was not defined by his shifting physiology, but by his persistent, agonizing choices. This final confession was not about Whitlock's guilt or salvation. It was about the line of human decency, which this ancient predator was forced to draw in blood, cycle after cycle, just to sustain his own monstrous morality. Andrew returned to his temporary base of operations, his cramped, overheated apartment in a city 500 miles away, and began to write. He resisted the lure of the massive online outlets and the instant sensational gratification. The story demanded a wider, quieter reach. It was published not in the screaming tabloids, but in a respected, rigorous, national analytical magazine known for its deep-dive reportage on social breakdown and localized crime. The article avoided all melodrama. Andrew did not provide Whitlock's location, nor did he offer any description of the man's appearance. Instead, he meticulously detailed the geography of the coastal region, the precise techniques criminals used to exploit the isolation of the forest masses, and the exact locations where local law enforcement was stretched too thin. He dedicated a detailed section to the calculated silence of Sheriff Hudson and the local authorities, arguing that they suppressed facts not to engage in conspiracy, but to prevent the devastating chaos of public panic. The core of the article was a meticulous accounting of systemic failure, anchored by a single, quiet, devastating paragraph that served as the story's unspoken climax. He did not offer proof, only implication, woven seamlessly into the stark documentary realism. "There operates among us," Andrew wrote, "an entity of immense, overwhelming force. It is older than our current laws, but it has adopted its own stringent code, a mechanism of necessary brutal control, because without rules, it could not survive itself. The community around the forest has learned to accept the unseen variable, preferring the terror of the unknown to the certainty of human malice." The piece detonated in the public sphere, but not as a simple horror story. Rationalists, academics, bloggers, and columnists demanded that Andrew produce the physical proof of the entity, labeling him a sensationalist and a liar. Yet, among those who lived in or near the deep American woods, especially in Maine, there was a quiet, knowing assent. The primary effect was exactly what Whitlock had desired. Public attention was yanked away from the vague idea of a mythical monster and redirected toward the tangible reality of the organized crime rings using the wilderness as cover. The fear was now focused, pragmatic, and directed. A week after publication, Andrew received an envelope. It had no return address, stamped with a postmark from a neighboring state, hundreds of miles from the coast. Inside was a single, heavy sheet of paper, a detailed topographical map of the coastline and the bordering forests. Marked on it, in neat, precise pencil, were dozens of small X's, identifying exact spots where evil is easy to commit and difficult to catch. It was pure empiricism, a professional's guide to vulnerability. On the reverse side of the map, written in a thin, precise script, was the final, devastating communication. The handwriting was light, yet applied with firm pressure. You honored the covenant, Mr. Price, but your text contained one small falsehood. You wrote that you did not intervene. You intervened the moment you covered the whelp with your jacket. That small human moment is what made you a trustworthy witness. It was the final judgment, a confirmation that Whitlock had chosen Andrew not for his professional skill, but for his inherent instinct toward protection. The monster's calculus had included Andrew's small, quiet act of kindness in the dark. Sheriff Hudson read the analytical piece carefully. Sitting in the cramped, humid heat of his office, the paper spread out across his desk. He nodded once, a brief, definitive movement. There were no sensational headlines to fight off, no immediate storm of amateur cryptozoologists descending on his jurisdiction. Instead, after the article's publication, the state allocated resources to the county. The roads around the quarry were patrolled twice as often. Unauthorized access points were monitored. The organized, illegal groups disappeared, replaced by simple caution. In Gray's diner, the local conversation shifted, not about the beast in the woods, but about pragmatic measures. Better lighting on the back roads, infrared cameras, and stiffer penalties for illegal entry. The city, in its pragmatic embrace of a controlled dread, became demonstrably safer. Andrew packed his remaining belongings. The rental sedan pointed south on United States Highway 1. He left the coastal town, but the peculiar quality of the silence stayed with him. It was not the silence of peace, but the quiet, heavy atmosphere of constant, vigilant awareness. He departed not as a victorious reporter who had broken a sensational story, but as a man who had been burdened with a massive, unwieldy, and deeply unprofitable truth. About 200 miles south, refueling the sedan at a dilapidated independent gas station off the main highway, Andrew saw him. Whitlock. He stood near the rear of the station by the overflowing, rusted dumpster, wearing the same faded, heavy overcoat. The man was utterly unremarkable in the harsh sunlight. He turned briefly, holding several cans of dented, expired canned meat and vegetables. With a deliberate, slow motion, he opened the cans and emptied the contents into the base of the trash receptacle. It was bait, not for himself, but a quiet, mundane task of logistics. A gesture to draw raccoons, possums, and smaller predators away from the busy highway and the fast-moving traffic. An effort to stop the small, pointless destruction of minor wildlife on the asphalt. There was no dramatic confrontation, no final farewell. Just a man who had seen 3 centuries of human viciousness, reduced now to performing small, necessary acts of preservation when the grand, loud acts were impossible. Whitlock did not look directly at Andrew. He finished his task, dusted his hands on his coat, and walked around the corner of the station, presumably to hitch a ride further south toward a new region, a new patch of forest, and a new fragile truce. It was the last thing Andrew saw of the man, the sheer everyday realism of the monster's lonely, persistent existence. Returning to his own quiet routine, Andrew archived the confession. The small digital recorder was placed in a heavy steel lockbox, an artifact of a primal negotiation. When he began outlining his book, he knew he could not use Whitlock's name as the title. He focused instead on the geography, the cold, stubborn coast. The true protagonist of this chronicle, he realized, was not immortality, but the specific stretch of ground where a creature defined by horror found a painful, agonizing way to live by the rules of men, and in so doing forced men to live, just a little, by the harsh, unforgiving rules of the forest. Months bled into a year. The town on the Maine coast, stubbornly refusing to yield to either modernization or hysteria, did not transform into a macabre tourist trap. Instead, it became a local anomaly, a place that, despite its isolated location, invested fiercely and effectively in localized security and vigilant, low-key patrolling. The fear had not vanished, but it had calcified, becoming a hard, necessary aspect of life, replacing the previous complacency. Andrew continued to receive occasional highly stylized letters from Sheriff Hudson. They contained no direct mention of the man in the wool coat, but they did contain statistical graphs and dry, meticulously detailed crime reports. The conclusion was undeniable. Illegal nocturnal activity in the forest periphery had dropped to absolute zero. The mechanism was operational. Working on the final drafts of his manuscript, Andrew grappled with the definition of the man he had chronicled. Whitlock was not a judge in the human codified sense. He was a ruthless ecological factor, a sentient variable that intervened to restore a balance that human disregard had disrupted, employing calculated extreme violence as his tool. This realization did not make Andrew's writing any easier, but it imbued his text with a deeper, unsettling honesty. It was documentary realism with a monstrous, invisible variable. Andrew's internal monologue, often triggered late at night in the sterile quiet of his city apartment, was dominated by sensory recall. The metallic tang of salt and fresh blood, the pungent, thick smell of wet wool and ammonia, and the memory of the profound silence before the eruption. He realized that the visceral power of the story lay not in the actions he witnessed, but in the depth of perception those actions had forced upon him. The way his body reacted to a horror his rational mind refused to fully accept. That was the true record. The book was eventually released, not as a sensational horror novel, but as a severe, unsettling treatise on vulnerability and organized crime in isolated American regions. Critics praised its stark realism, even while noting the unexplained, pervasive element of anxiety that suffused the narrative. Andrew had delivered exactly what Whitlock had orchestrated: a pragmatic, directed fear, a warning embedded in hard fact. One late autumn afternoon, a year after his departure, Andrew drove back to the coast. He parked the car and walked out onto the Old Point Pier. The granite blocks were wet with spray, the wooden decking slippery. The cold, raw wind blew in from the immense gray ocean. The bench where they had conducted the confession was empty. There was no lingering scent of metal or old wool, no immediate oppressive sense of presence. But the silence, That same unnatural, cautious silence was precisely where he had left it. It did not feel abandoned. It felt monitored. Andrew understood that Whitlock, the man, had moved on, continuing his centuries-long, exhausting migration south or west. But the mechanism, the necessary dread, remained. And it was that invisible, palpable truth, the silence of vigilance, that Andrew Price had brought back from the coast of Maine.